Alright, so you know how this goes? Welcome to another edition of Awkward Videos by me, Miss Mallon. In this video, we need to figure out what's going on in the Middle East in this age of imperialism. And as was noted in class, most of the imperialist activities happening in the Middle East are more in the form of economic imperialism. And essentially, the Ottoman Empire has been ruling the majority of the Middle East since we're talking the 15th century going forward, and we're seeing that it's slowly falling apart. It was called the sick man of Europe because as quickly as it rose and it reached its heights really under Suleiman the Magnificent, it went through a lot of political turmoil and made a lot of bad economic decisions that led to its decline to stretch from, some argue from the early 1600s to the 20th century to some say a little bit later, but regardless, a couple centuries of slow decline and lots of dependence on European powers as they were growing. So we're going to look at a couple reactions to that, some reformist movements that happen, and some conservative movements that happen as a result. All right, here we go. So we know that the Ottoman Empire was very large, and that its biggest obstacle was that it was a Turkish government ruling over a multi-ethnic empire. And so what we see beginning in the early 19th century is that that age of nationalism, tapping into these new senses of cultural identity, began to work against the Ottoman Empire in conjunction with the fact that many local politicians were criticizing the Ottoman Empire for not innovating, for not keeping up with the times. And we see these movements really begin in Egypt, where a very interesting politician named Muhammad Ali, not that Muhammad Ali, but actually an Albanian, began to organize the Arab Egyptians to rise up against the central Ottoman Empire. This really begins after the French invasion during the Napoleonic era of Egypt. So as the French invade and then subsequently leave, they leave a political vacuum during which the former Mamluks who had ruled Egypt before tried to take advantage of that political vacuum, and then the Ottomans respond. And while they're fighting, essentially, Muhammad Ali is able to tap into an intellectual movement, to these college or these university type peoples and intellectuals who are looking to reform Egypt. He wins public support and essentially is able to win out as the politician and, via war, take power from the Ottomans. Essentially, he calls them out for being a decaying empire and not industrializing and reforming. And once he's able to take Egypt forcibly, one of his first steps he does is nationalize all the land so that he can have major revenues, but also take it from these mismanaging landowners and corrupt, essentially noble class. By nationalizing the land, we can make more money off of it, but also more universally, or rather centrally, industrialize and reform. So he's going to help the central economy by industrializing the cotton industry. He's also going to build up the military industry by making musket factories and other gun factories. He's also going to build a notable shipyard at Alexandria so they can get on the shipping game. He will modernize the military, and he'll keep a somewhat decent relationship with the Ottoman Empire, but ultimately kind of sets off this wave where now many other nations say that they want to be independent from this Turkish empire, especially they want to get off this kind of dying government before it totally implodes. So he's kind of our first example of this change. Another key separatist movement that helped to dismantle the Ottoman Empire is the Greek independence movement that happens after the Egyptian independence movement. Greece has had issue with being a part of the Ottoman Empire for a long period of time, and Greece, and up further north, has been a source of the Janissaries and Devshirme, as we know. And the Greek independence movement is more than just the Greeks. It becomes this larger European movement known as the Pan-Hellenic movement. It's as if the other European powers look at Greece as a symbol of Europe. It says where the European civilization really began, if we look at the greater themes of world history. And so many of the European nations felt an obligation to help Greece become independent from the Ottoman Empire. So countries such as Great Britain and France and various other European powers create an allied effort, commit troops to the Greek independence effort, and lead to the independence of Greece, further weakening the Ottoman Empire. One of the key reasons behind the weakness of the Ottoman Empire at this point is a practice called the capitulations. So the capitulations are a series of treaties, hundreds of treaties, that go back to the 16th century and some before, that were simply a series of agreements that would be between the Ottoman Empire and some other groups, most of them European, especially with the French. There was a huge Franco-Ottoman alliance. And for the most part, they were mutually beneficial. But over time, as Europe became more of an industrial and economic power, they were able to gain more access to various resources and essentially gain more rights than the typical Ottoman in the Ottoman Empire. And thus, the Ottoman Empire becomes highly dependent on the Europeans, and this becomes a central point for the reformists who want to see change in the Ottoman Empire. As I said, the history of the capitulations goes back to the 15th and 16th centuries, and some of the most notable capitulations were between the Ottoman Empire and France, as seen here with Suleiman and his big onion hat, and Francis I of France. The first capitulations were usually to give extra protections to French or other European Christians in the Holy Land and things of that nature. But over time, they also did things like lower customs rates to give key allies more trade power in the Ottoman Empire, or sometimes even provide protection against the Barbary pirates. So at this point, it's a win-win. By doing this, the Ottoman is getting more trade, the other group is also getting more money and protection, so it's all good. But over time, as the Ottoman Empire becomes more dependent, and also as the Janissaries become a more unruly, military, the Ottomans become more dependent on the Europeans, not just for industry's sake, but also for protections. So often they would give more capitulations to the French in order to get more help against the Habsburgs, who were territorially close and always threatening the Ottoman Empire. But by doing this, by we reach the time of the 1800s, the typical European has been granted extraterritoriality. The French governments have more invested, actually have more money in the Ottoman Empire than the Ottomans themselves. And the typical European and the non-Muslim have more privileges than the average Muslim in the Ottoman Empire. And so we start to see many groups seek reform in this era. This reformist era begins under Mahmud II, who was a sultan, who was quickly overthrown by the ulama, or the religious community, since he was seeking secular reforms. Ultimately, all these reformist groups are very westernized in their style. And we see Mahmud II, even though he fails and he's overthrown, we see his sentiments continued in the Tanzimat reforms, which are based in this intellectual class that was seeking to westernize and modernize the Ottoman Empire. And essentially, a big thing they were trying to do is dismantle the millet system. They wanted to stop the tide of nationalism, which was making all these other ethnic groups want to break away. So they wanted full equality before the law and to secularize things enough that no one felt that Sharia law would exclude them, whatever religion, whatever ethnic group that they'd like. So they wanted equality in the penal code, in the commercial code, and all things of that nature. The next step in this process is the rise of the Young Turks, because every time one of these reformist groups rose, the Ottoman sultans would crush them. So the Young Turks are a more radical reformist group that will lead to the next phase of reform in the Ottoman Empire. So the Young Turks dethroned Sultan Al-Hamid II, who was the sultan responsible for undoing the Tanzimat reforms. And after this, they established a constitutional monarchy, passing their own constitution that were in many ways simply continuations of the Tanzimat constitution. And within this constitution, they extend incredibly progressive reforms such as universal suffrage, they open more public education, more equality before the law, freedoms and protections for religion. And one of their biggest things is emancipating the women. And we can see here in this cartoon that this one woman who originally had been shackled, that these Young Turk politicians had cut those shackles, and now she is free and she's able to vote and own property and all these things. And they saw that the freedom of women is central to the progression of society. And also behind her are many other nationalities kind of claiming that as long as you keep in line with the Young Turks, that you will also enjoy this freedom and this progress and all this stuff. But there is a dark side to the Young Turks because they also believed that they needed to push the sense of Turkish nationalism, which is kind of odd since they wanted to keep everyone as part of the Ottoman Empire. But they did this in a few ways. They did this by pushing Turkish as the official language, which is something that the Ottoman Empire never did before. They were more accepting of the multilingual nature of their empire. And also, they aligned with eventually the Central Powers during World War I. They aligned with Germany mostly because they had just entered in some economic alliances. And during this, they kind of get wrapped up into this nationalist era and are ultimately responsible for the Armenian genocide, as the Armenians did have a separatist movement. Not that they were literally trying to secede, but they were opposing many of these more central nationalist laws that the Young Turks had been passing. They had protested that. And so, under the cover of World War I, the Young Turks were responsible for a very dark and terrible genocide, which we will learn more about in our 20th century unit. After their defeat in World War I, what was left of the Ottoman Empire was dismantled via the Treaty of Versailles and divvied up between the French and the British. Seen here is one part of what is called the mandate system, in which these are not technically colonies, but they are. And the borders that were drawn, as we'll talk more in the 20th century, are fairly arbitrary and will lead to some of the ethnic and religious disputes in the Middle East. And this did extend to the main Anatolian Peninsula. So now all of the former empire is under European control, and this doesn't sit well with some key politicians and reformers of the former Ottoman Empire, most notably Mustafa Kemal, who eventually becomes known as Ataturk, who was the father of modern Turkey. And once he leads Turkey in the War of Independence from, or rather against the British, he creates a full republic, instituting a parliament and elections and full suffrage. He invests heavily in education, including creating the Turkish script to make it easier for more people to learn. He'll reform the universities. A big thing, again, is the inclusion of women in parliament, as seen here, the first women serving in parliament. Women went to university, as seen here in this picture of the University of Ankara. He also even extended things like allowing women to take part in beauty pageants, which is something that the more conservative religious community was against. And so he included all of these new reforms that are generally westernizing and improving the conditions for the majority of people. But he also emphasized secularization. He thought that was key in creating a more modern government. But this will also create some enemies or some contrary movements within the Muslim world. Similar to the Fulani movement in West Africa, Wahhabism is a movement that is growing in reaction to European presence, and really it was mostly in reaction to these quote-unquote Muslim governments that seem to be abandoning Sharia law and abandoning the culture of Islam, founded by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was a close friend of the Saudi family that was beginning to rule what is now like Saudi Arabia. He wanted to return to very traditional conservative values. He wanted Sharia law to be the law of the land, which is why Saudi Arabia is a theocracy today. And so he wanted to return to these values. He wanted to see really conservative things such as full separation of the sexes, which is why in Saudi weddings you typically see two parties, one for the men, one for the women. So it's not really intermixed celebration. This is why we see women are banned from driving, which is why women have to be fully clothed, all of these things. So not every reformist movement is one that is progressive necessarily in growing more liberal. This is an example within Islam that is actually very reactionary, that is very conservative, and also plants the seeds for some hyper-conservative movements, which we know end up in terrorism today. All right, so that's it for our look at the Middle East and what's happening in the 19th century into the 20th century for the Middle East. So really supplemented a lot of stuff. A lot of the stuff is in your book, especially the latter half of this video. So hopefully you paid attention to the assignment that goes with this. And I was originally going to add a little Russian stuff, but I'm not. We'll tag it on into some of the 20th century stuff, but what is a part of your notes for this unit And in the book, you're responsible for. So just suck it up and do it. All right, that's it. Bye.